Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would do this little video that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video that I'm going to review, at least firstly by that of Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation. And secondly, the other two videos that I'm going to review is going to be by a boxing channel that I review every now and then called Johnboxing Pound for Pound the Best. And the reason why I like to review these videos once again, and a lot of videos in general once again, is because these guys have a lot these guys have a lot of propaganda that they really love to push out there. And don't get it twisted, that's not me stating that necessarily every single point that they make that I disagree with about every single fighter. But, for them bitching and moaning and complaining about the racial double standards and a lot of the racism and, certain things that end up happening in boxing, they probably might be the most racially motivated channels, or some of the most racially motivated channels that I've seen out of any other boxing content creators. And that's why I have to be very careful, especially not just with boxing, but really sports in general. Because once again, I've been saying this for a very long time. Sports is really very politically motivated. To be quite honest with you, a lot of things, almost everything in life nowadays is very politically motivated. And in sports, what that means is that a certain amount of these content creators or news reporters or people on Fox Sports News or that of ESPN or whatever it may be, a certain amount of the things that they're really going to push out there, a lot of it may not be necessarily based on what happened, but what they wanted to happen or what they based on what happened. And you have to be very careful, because how you can tell when someone is really full of shit and when they're just hating on that particular fighter or hating on that particular athlete, it's very easy to tell. You just take a look at the standards that they have for that particular athlete or that particular fighter, and then take a look at the standards of some of the other fighters that they talk about or some of the other athletes that they talk about. For example, when Floyd Mayweather Jr. was around, Floyd Mayweather Jr., there were certain people that said that he was quote-unquote ducking Gennady Golovkin or ducking Sergio Martinez, even though Floyd Mayweather Jr. had never fought above 154 pounds. And of course, both of those guys were 160-pounder middleweight champions, and Floyd Mayweather Jr. really was not even a natural welterweight anyway. Now, in terms of height and reach, was he built like a welterweight? He was built like a welterweight in that way. But in terms of the weight, he was never really a true welterweight. And I see the same thing with that of a Canelo Alvarez, especially with these Dante's Boxing Nations and the Aki TVs and these guys. And of course, a big part of the reason why they've been trying to tear down Canelo Alvarez for a very long time is because, in all actuality, just like the haters of Floyd Mayweather Jr. during his heyday, they see how truly great of a talent and how great of a fighter he actually is. And once again, for those of you that truly want to know, once again, about who is the actual greatest of that generation or who actually is looked at as the biggest threat, take a look at the standards that are placed upon that particular athlete. When we take a look, at NBA basketball, even though LeBron James, even though many of his fans want to claim that he's the most impactful and that he's the most valuable player ever, if LeBron James does not have the most talented roster of that particular year, he's almost never favored to win the NBA Finals. And you know why that is? Because LeBron James is not the greatest NBA player of all time, nor is he the most impactful, nor is he the most valuable, nor is he the most skilled NBA player of all time. Now, is he an all-time great NBA player? Is he someone that I would put within my top 10, debatably even top 5? Absolutely, no doubt about it. But the LeBron James fans, they try to put him in the media as this dude that is so magnanimous as a player and this guy that always makes the players around him better and someone that we've never seen this type of impact before, and he makes players around him greater and actually improve. Well, if that were the case, and if LeBron James can actually make players around him improve, how come in the 2017 finals, when the Warriors had Kevin Durant, Klay Thompson, and Steph Curry, as well as Draymond Green, so about 3.5 all-star level players, to be quite honest with you, LeBron James had himself, he had Kyrie Irving, he had Kevin Love, those are 3 all-star level players, not even talking about some of the great role players that he had, like J.R. Smith and some of the other guys, Tristan Thompson, that could have got some decent offense, or 3-and-D, or maybe some good offensive or defensive rebounding. If you're supposed to be the most impactful player of all time, and the most valuable player of all time, why does your team end up getting blown out by 20 plus points almost every single game in that series? Don't sit here and tell me that you're the greatest player of all time and that you're the most impactful, but it's 3 all-stars versus about 3.5 or 4.5 or 4 all-stars, and you lose within 5 games and you get blown out pretty much your back blown out throughout the majority of those games, and not even just against the Warriors. Also against the San Antonio Spurs in 2014, you lose against the Dallas Mavericks, who had one all-star potential player. That's why anyone who knows basketball, for example, not to digress too much, knows that LeBron James is not the true greatest player, nor is he the most impactful player of all time. Because if you are the most impactful player of all time, you can at least take those teams to 6 or 7 games, because you had 2 all-star level caliber players on both of those teams, and I see a very similar thing here. The point is that once again, when you take a look at who truly is the greatest of their particular sport, or who people actually believe is a threat, you don't take a look at the person that they overall uplift the most. You take a look at the person that they really try to downtrod, or that they really try to criticize the most, because that is the person that they realize is going to be a threat to the person that they worship, or the person that they want to keep in first place. And that's why Canelo Alvarez, and now Alexander Usyk, and in a way now a little bit, which I've been telling people now for a very long time, they've been now receiving the most amount of criticism, some justifiable, some not, from the LDBC and new media, because they want Terence Bud Crawford to for sure be remembered as the greatest of this era. That's what they want him to be remembered as. And just in my view, Terence Bud Crawford is not for sure the greatest of this era. Now, if you want to claim him as the best and as the most dominant and as the greatest of this era, I have no problem with that whatsoever. But don't sit here and spread this bullshit about how, Canelo Alvarez or some of these other fighters compared to Terence Bud Crawford just don't compare, and that it's not even a contest, and that Canelo Alvarez doesn't even compare to certain fighters like Marco Antonio Barrera or Eric Morales, or that Alexander Usyk is not an all-time great level fighter because, who all did he beat, blah, 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 even though he beat Tyson Fury and beat Anthony Joshua, 2 fighters that they held in very high esteem before it was very clear that their favorite pro-black fighter, Dante, was not going to win in that division. Then all of a sudden they tried to completely tear down that weight class as soon as it was very clear that the 2 best heavyweights of the generation were going to be 2 Caucasians. Isn't that very particularly interesting? Don't give me this bullshit about how Terence Bud Crawford is immediately top 5 to top 10 of all time in terms of being an all-time great level fighter, but then give me this bullshit about overall how Canelo Alvarez and Alexander Usyk, that they're not all-time great level fighters. Because if we're truly going to go into it, if we really want to be real about Terence Bud Crawford and be a harsh critic, out of all the 3 fighters that can be remembered as all-time great level fighters of this generation, that being Canelo Alvarez, Alexander Usyk, and Terence Bud Crawford, Terence Bud Crawford probably has the worst resume out of all 3 of them. And if we're really going to go there, he probably doesn't even have the resume of certain guys like a Vasily Lomachenko or an Errol Spence Jr. really to top it off, and a certain amount of other fighters. And I know that a certain amount of the Terence Bud Crawford fanboys are not going to like that. It is what it is. And listen, I like Terence Bud Crawford to a great degree. I think that he's an all-time great level fighter. I think that he's one of the greatest fighters that I have ever personally seen. But what the Terence Bud Crawford fans love to do is that they love to give you this bullshit about how excellent his resume is. And I've been telling people this for the longest time. Terence Bud Crawford does not have this all-time great level resume. Now, to be an all-time great level fighter, you don't always have to have a Floyd Mayweather or a Manny Pacquiao type of resume. Now, he still has a good enough resume, or a great enough resume in my view, to be remembered as an all-time great level fighter. But is he someone, once again, that has this Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao, or even a Canelo Alvarez or Alexander Usyk type of resume? No, he doesn't. And I know that a certain amount of people, once again, they're not going to be happy with that, but it is what it is. But once again, the reason why I wanted to review this video is because Canelo Alvarez and Terence Bud Crawford, there's been many talks now for a while about this fight potentially happening. And what Dante's Boxing Nation wants you to believe, what he keeps selling to the public, or keeps trying to sell to the public, is that Terence Bud Crawford is the undisputed best and the greatest of this era in terms of boxing, and that Canelo Alvarez, that not only is he the most overrated fighter of this era, but that he's the most overrated fighter of all time. That's what Dante's Boxing Nation is really trying to sell to you. And that Canelo and other certain guys like Usyk or other guys like that were only ranked as the #1 pound per pound because they wanted to spite certain black fighters, and that they really didn't want a certain black fighter being looked at as the best in boxing. And although some of those points can be a little bit true to a degree in terms of spiting black fighters or trying to tear them down, Canelo Alvarez was not ranked as the #1 pound per pound because they wanted to spite a black fighter. They put Canelo Alvarez as the #1 pound per pound because he was a 4-weight division champion. He had been completely undisputed in a weight class. And on top of that, he was fighting the best level of competition for the past several years. But we're going to be talking about that as the video goes along. But anyways, Dante's going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So it's a new year, and everyone is still talking about the super fight or the potential super fight between Terence Crawford.
Dante loves this sparring clip where he shows Canelo Alvarez getting hit in the face with the jab repeatedly. But isn't it so interesting? You're never going to find a sparring clip of Deontay Wilder getting completely outboxed by Filip Hrgović. You're never going to find sparring footage of Deontay Wilder damn near getting knocked down against David Haye. You're never going to find those sparring videos. But, whenever it comes to a sparring video that he needs to put out there in order to tear a fighter down, like Dillian Whyte allegedly knocking out Tyson Fury, then he went with that narrative for so long about how Fury was avoiding Dillian Whyte. And then then they get in the ring, and Fury, he talks about, Fury, he completely whoops his ass. And then, then Dante's Boxing Nation, this dude is such a snake. Like I said, this dude, once again, he never keeps the same standards. This dude might be the worst boxing reporter that I've personally seen out of any ESPN reporter, out of any Fox Sports reporter, out of any content creator, because this dude will literally, once again, change his mind on a daily as long as it fits his narrative. You can never trust what this dude says.
And Canelo Alvarez. By the way, this clip I'm playing in the background right here, this is Canelo Alvarez sparring with Ronald Ellis. With that being said, Tim Bradley, he came out and he just said it point blank. He said Crawford is going to beat the shit out of Canelo Alvarez. But that's not even the most interesting part.
Right, someone who's a completely, impartial, what's the word I'm looking for? Someone that, of course, is going to be a completely logical source when you talk about that, because it's not like Timothy Bradley is, best friends with Terence Bud Crawford or anything, and that Timothy Bradley is the one that really introduced Terence Bud Crawford to some of the other guys out there, because I believe that Timothy Bradley, for those of you that don't remember, before I believe his second fight with Manny Pacquiao, he was sparring Terence Bud Crawford, and he said that Crawford was giving him the work, that he was actually whooping his ass. And he said, "Who are you?" And he said that I'm Terence Bud Crawford, I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. And Timothy Bradley said, "You're going to be a champion someday." And of course, eventually Terence Bud Crawford was. And his first championship level fight was against Ricky Burns. The three-weight division Caucasian European champion, from Britain, that Terence Bud Crawford fanboys love to say is A grade. But then when it comes to guys like Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders, apparently those guys are just bums on Canelo's resume. That guy. But anyway.
The most interesting part is why he said it. He said he woke up and he did film study.
What's good? I'm back again, the biggest.
And I don't necessarily mind Timothy Bradley. Timothy Bradley, of course, gets a bad rap by a certain amount of the boxing fans and the boxing community, because at times, of course, he can say kind of stupid statements or incredulous statements. But I don't really mind Timothy Bradley all the time, because there's certain times where I think that he says something to where it's a little bit insightful. But a little bit lately, he's been on a roll for kind of saying stupid shit. But, it is what it is.
Hated in the sport of boxing. Yo, real quick, just got done. I woke up 3 a.m. I don't know, someone told me to study Canelo, study Crawford. Crawford about to beat the shit out of Canelo Alvarez. I'm letting y'all know right now, he about to beat the brakes off of Canelo Alvarez. Yes, he is.
You see, it's one thing for somebody to just randomly say, Crawford is going to win the fight. But it's another thing when you're talking about studying film. And then you have a professional fighter like Tim Bradley saying he's studying the film. Because first of all, this is exactly what I do. When there's like a big fight and it's considered a very competitive fight, a pick'em fight, a 50-50, or even a 60-40 fight.
Right, and we all know that you're great with analytical breakdowns, Dante. We all know that, once again, you haven't got a lot of your predictions completely wrong, because you base a lot of them off of racial motivation and shit that you just see on the surface. There's no offense against Dante's Boxing Nation, but this dude is an idiot. Like I said, Dante is not the most intelligent when it comes down to breaking boxing fights. But certain people can watch a particular sport, they can play a particular sport for years, and they're just never going to get it. They're never going to get how to break down a boxing fight analytically, or, who to pick in certain fights. And don't get it twisted, I've gotten fight predictions wrong. We all get fight predictions wrong. Certain things don't always come to plan. But Dante's Boxing Nation is not a smart analytical breakdown artist. Or on top of that, once again, a lot of times he's just full of shit. He lets his emotion and he lets his biasness and his racial motivation pretty much get in the way of a lot of his picks. That's why he says stupid shit. And you can tell that Dante don't believe a lot of this bullshit that he says. Because remember when he said that shit about how when Jermell Charlo and Canelo Alvarez that, oh, both the Charlo brothers would beat Canelo. But then when Canelo was about to face either Charlo brother, when it came to Jamal, oh, Jamal's not the same. Then when it came to Jermell Charlo, he said, well, Jermell Charlo, he's going to be way too light. Right, well, you weren't saying that when you were talking all that shit about when the fight wasn't going to happen. When the fight wasn't potentially going to happen, Dante was talking all this shit about, oh, well, we don't know. Brian Castano may be a harder fight for Jermell Charlo than what Canelo Alvarez is. Right, so then how come Jermell Charlo didn't win a single round against Canelo Alvarez? Like, this dude, once again, this dude is such a moron. And a politician.
To do for certain fights is I will watch both fighters over and over and over again, leading all the way up to the fight sometime. But like I said, I don't do this too often. The last time I did this was probably for the Canelo versus Bivol fight. I'd watch Canelo versus Kovalev.
And that explains why you get so many of your fight analyzations so off basis and why so much of the shit that you say really doesn't make any goddamn sense. That would explain why you're saying stupid shit like Brian Castano's going to give Jermell Charlo a tougher fight than Canelo Alvarez. Yeah, he sure did.
I would watch a couple of Bivol fights, different opponents, and I would do this over and over and over again. And after I kept watching those fights, I was absolutely sure that Bivol was going to beat Canelo Alvarez, which you guys already know because
No, you weren't, because even coming into there, you said you weren't really quite sure who was going to win. Dante's Boxing Nation, a certain amount of these guys do this shit all the time, where they claim that, oh, I know that this guy's going to destroy this guy. He talks all this shit about this guy destroying Canelo. But just in case Canelo Alvarez is going to win that fight, he said, oh, well, the reason why Canelo Alvarez is picking Dimitri Bivol is because he has a European style. More than likely, it's easier than the Charlo brothers style or Demetrius Bubu Andre. That's what he said. Even though anyone who knew shit about boxing, I'm talking about the real boxing aficionados that actually know shit about boxing, knew that Dimitri Bivol was always above those guys, and that he was always going to be a bigger threat, not just in terms of his size, but also in terms of his athleticism and boxing ability. But, anyway.
Had already made predictions talking about it leading up to the fight, and I had said it on many different videos. Now, don't get me wrong, every prediction is not that easy, because if it was, I would be a millionaire right now just betting on fights. But
if you bet on fights, Dante's Boxing Nation, you wouldn't even have a house, because you'd be losing 75% of those bets.
Comes to Canelo Alvarez, he makes the predictions a little bit easier because he has so many flaws and he is so predictable, which is clearly what Tim Bradley sees. The Canelo Alvarez...
And this is one of the things that Dante's Boxing Nation keeps trying to feed to the public, which is that Canelo Alvarez is so flawed and that he's predictable. And listen, what I'll state is this. Canelo Alvarez in most recent years, probably the past 3 years, probably ever since the Dimitri Bivol fight, or ever since, he fought Dimitri Bivol onward, I think that he's become a little bit more predictable, and I definitely think that he started aging as a fighter. I've definitely seen more flaws in Canelo Alvarez's style than I probably ever have before in most recent years, probably about the past 3 years, ever since he fought Bivol and onward, because I think that he's starting to get a little bit slower. I think that in the Bivol fight, there was also a little bit of overconfidence, coming into that fight that quickly, of course, went away after Bivol showed that he was a real deal. And, on top of that, Canelo's just clearly aging as a fighter. He just is. He's 34 years old. He's going to be 35 next year, but he's really more like a 38 to 39-year-old. He's been fighting now. This year is 2025. Is going to be 20 years this year. He started at the age of 15 years old. When he turns 35 this year, he'd have been boxing professionally for 20 years. Most careers end at about 20 to 21 years. Not every single one, but keep in mind that Canelo Alvarez has a lot of wear and tear and tread on his tires at the current moment in time. But Dante's Boxing Nation, he's not going to talk about that. He's going to, act like Canelo Alvarez is pretty much the same spring chicken that he was 10 years ago. But then when it comes to other fighters, oh, well, they don't look the same. Like, once again, this dude is such a fucking politician, man. Like, this dude is really just a joke.
That we see today is the exact same Canelo Alvarez that lost to Floyd Mayweather back in 2000.
No, it's not the exact same Canelo Alvarez that lost to Floyd Mayweather. But once again, Dante keeps trying to spring this up because, once again, he realizes that Canelo Alvarez is going to be remembered by a lot of people as an all-time great. Now, don't get it twisted. If you want to state something along the lines of Canelo Alvarez, in my view, is not a greater fighter than Floyd, he's not a more skilled fighter than Floyd, and that he's not above Floyd Mayweather, in my personal view, that's completely okay to say. I think that that's fine. But to state something along the lines of Canelo's made no adjustments, he's the exact same fighter as what he was over 10 years ago, that just doesn't make any sense. There's no way that you could be the same fighter that you were over 10 years ago, and then you become a champion in 3 more weight classes, beat some of the best names out there in some of those weight classes, and then overall dominate some of those guys, knock some of those guys out, and then you're just apparently the exact same fighter as you were back then. That don't make any fucking sense.
2013. Matter of fact, that loss to Floyd Mayweather was one of Canelo Alvarez's best performances, despite the fact that he lost every single round. Guys, how is...
Yes, that was one of Canelo Alvarez's best performances against Floyd Mayweather Jr. Even though he damn near lost every round against Floyd Mayweather Jr. Yes, that was one of his best performances. The way that Dante's Boxing Nation is talking, you would think that Canelo Alvarez is like the Mexican version of Adrian Broner or something. Like, this dude, man. This dude is just out of his mind.
Is it possible Terence Crawford, he's willing to move up 2 to 3 weight classes, and the majority of the professional boxing world, the professional boxers and trainers, they're all picking Crawford to beat Canelo?
Well, are the majority of trainers and boxers really picking Terence Bud Crawford, Dante, or are you pretty much just putting that out there once again? Because what Dante wants is that he wants to have his cake, and he wants to eat it too. That's what Dante's Boxing Nation really wants. You know, he wants Canelo Alvarez to be looked at as quote-unquote the most overrated fighter of all time, but then at the same time, if Terence Bud Crawford beats Canelo, Terence Bud Crawford to debatably be called the greatest fighter ever. How does that work? How does that make Terence Bud Crawford the greatest fighter ever, quote-unquote, if Canelo Alvarez is allegedly the most overrated fighter of all time, and if he's just the average Mexican boxer that you're trying to claim him? That doesn't make any fucking sense. Because if Terence Bud Crawford went to the 168-pound weight class and beat someone like a John Ryder, who was a champion, someone who's quote-unquote more average for that weight class, or William Skull, for example, no one would be saying that Terence Bud Crawford is the greatest fighter of all time because of that. So, once again, Dante does not truly believe what the hell he's saying, but he has a narrative to play out, and he hates Canelo Alvarez's guts. So he has to say this.
Alvarez. What does that say about Terence Crawford, and what does it say about Canelo? If the roles were...
Right, so Dante, if we want to play that little game about what that says about Terence Bud Crawford, about how great he is, and how overrated Canelo Alvarez is, allegedly, okay, no problem. But then Canelo Alvarez is not like he's not only heavier than Terence Bud Crawford, but also taller than Crawford. Canelo was not taller than Crawford. He's 5'7.5" with a 71-inch arm reach. Terence Bud Crawford has a 74-inch arm reach, and he's about half an inch taller than that of Canelo Alvarez as well. So what I'm going to need you to do is this, Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation. If you claim that Canelo Alvarez is so overrated and that he's this average Mexican fighter and not really that skilled and so flawed and so basic, apparently, to what you allege, then if Terence Bud Crawford is that good and that much better than Canelo Alvarez, Canelo was not really a natural 168-pounder anyway, because he's only 5'7.5" with a 71-inch arm reach, and he only really rehydrates to about 183 to 185. Terence Bud Crawford in his last fight rehydrated, I believe, over 170 pounds. So once again, if Terence Bud Crawford is that good, and if Canelo Alvarez is that flawed, then what that means is that you should favor Terence Bud Crawford in the Canelo Alvarez fight. And what that means is that if Canelo Alvarez beats the shit out of Terence Bud Crawford, and Crawford wins very few rounds or gets knocked out against Canelo Alvarez, what that means then is that Terence Bud Crawford is massively overrated. That's what you have to say. Because Terence Bud Crawford, don't sit here and tell me this bullshit about how Terence Bud Crawford, overall, once again, he's way more skilled than Canelo, and that Terence Bud Crawford, many of these fighters and trainers are favoring him over Canelo because Canelo was so basic and so flawed. All right, no problem. But then if you're going to go by these narratives, if Terence beats Canelo Alvarez, then don't call Terence Bud Crawford debatably the greatest fighter of all time. Because how can you be the greatest fighter of all time when you beat a fighter that is so basic and just an average Mexican fighter? How can you be the greatest of all time when you just beat that guy? It's very clear that Dante's Boxing Nation knows the skill level and the talent level of a Canelo Alvarez, but he hates this man's guts and his emotions are getting through.
Completely reversed.
So once again, Dante's Boxing Nation, what he really wants is that he wants Crawford to go up to Canelo Alvarez's weight, beat the hell out of him, or at least beat him, And then in that respect, he can say, see how great Terence Bud Crawford is and see how overrated Canelo Alvarez is. And then on top of that, he realizes that if Crawford beats Canelo, that no other fighter of this generation will be debatable as the greatest fighter of this generation, not even Usyk or Canelo Alvarez. So that's what Dante's Boxing Nation really wants. But if Canelo ends up beating the shit out of Terence Bud Crawford, then he can say, oh, well, Terence Bud Crawford was 37 years old, and then Terence Bud Crawford, he was a guy that clearly was at a massive size disadvantage. And listen, Crawford is going to be at a size disadvantage, at least weight-wise. There's going to be no doubt about that. But don't sit here and talk all this shit, overall about, oh, well, Canelo is so limited, he's so this, he's so that, right? And Terence Bud Crawford is apparently levels above him. This is what we always hear. Even though for anyone that knows boxing, that's bullshit, but, that's the narrative that Dante's, trying to put out there. Okay, so then that means that if Terence ends up losing this fight, what you have to acquiesce is that Terence was not as good as what you thought he was. That's what that has to mean. Because you can't just lose to a guy that is 5'7.5" with a 71-inch arm reach, a guy that is not as tall or as lengthy as you, and a guy that apparently is levels below you, and a guy that's just an average level boxer, and someone that's so flawed and limited. Don't sit here and tell me that if Crawford ends up getting dominated in that fight, or loses that fight, or gets knocked out in that fight, don't sit here and tell me that Terence Bud Crawford overall is this all-time great level fighter, or this guy that's on the Mayweather level. Don't sit here and tell me that, because then that means Crawford would have to be overrated. So then don't make the excuse if you want this fight to happen that badly, and if you want, once again, Terence Bud Crawford to get all the credit if he beats Canelo, no problem. But then one or two things is going to have to happen, at least if you're a logical or an objective thinker, or not even that. But if you really stand by the shit that you quote-unquote believe, either A, you're going to have to claim that Canelo is better than what you actually believe that he was. We already know Dante is not going to do that. Or B, you'd have to say that Crawford is not as good as what you once originally thought that he was, and he's a bit overrated. But you're not going to do that either. So what Dante's Boxing Nation really is doing is that he's playing a political game, and that basically he gets the best of both worlds. If Terence Bud Crawford moves up to that weight, gets his ass kicked over Canelo Alvarez, he can basically just make the excuse about how old Terence Bud Crawford was and how Terence Bud Crawford was clearly undersized. But if he beats Crawford, then of course he can claim that Crawford is the clear best of his generation, and that Crawford is way better than Canelo, and that he's the greatest of all time, and that Canelo is just way overhyped and way overrated. So that's what Dante's Boxing Nation really wants. But he already has his excuses prepared just in case Canelo Alvarez wins that fight, which more than likely he would.
And it was Terence Crawford that was a natural super middleweight. And Canelo was talking about moving from welterweight all the way to 168 to fight Crawford. Not one single person would be picking Canelo to win that fight. And we all know that, including Mexican fighters. And there would be no Mexican fans picking Canelo to win that fight. But I believe deep down, Canelo, he feels this Crawford fight is just as difficult as the Floyd Mayweather fight was for him. I mean, just think about this. Canelo has been fighting.
I don't think Canelo Alvarez believes that the Crawford fight is going to be as difficult as Floyd, but I do think that he realizes, because all-time great boxers can realize when they're in there with another all-time great level talent. I think that both of them realize that they're in there probably with, Canelo, I'm not going to say that he's in there with the greatest fighter that he's ever been in there with, because I think the greatest fighter that he's ever been in there with was Floyd Mayweather Jr. Now in terms of the threat level, I would say that Floyd was probably number one. I'd say Golovkin was probably two, maybe, Lara maybe number three, and then maybe some other ones, probably Bivol. Well, that's, probably not actually. Bivol would probably be at number two because of the size and the skill combined. And then after that, probably Golovkin and some other guys. But in terms of pound for pound acclaim, yeah, Golovkin probably would have been two. But anyways, in terms of talking about it, I do think that Canelo realizes that Crawford is an all-time great, and then he says, if I'm going to give Crawford the opportunity to possibly beat me, and overall, this could possibly ruin my career if he does potentially beat me, because he is a very dangerous fighter, then I'm going to get paid for this fight. And I have no problem with that really whatsoever. Why should Terence Bud Crawford get the opportunity at 160 pounds? And overall, once again, 168 pounds, you've never even fought at 160. And once again, it's a win-win situation for you. If you get the shit kicked out of you by Canelo Alvarez, you can just make the size excuse. And then if you win against Canelo, once again, you're on top of the world. But if Canelo ends up winning, he's just going to be, people will say, well, why'd you take that fight? You were way bigger. And if he ends up losing that fight, then it's even more embarrassing. So Canelo is in a lose-lose, while Terence Bud Crawford's in a win-win. So that's why Canelo Alvarez has always been a little bit apprehensive to take that fight, because he's like, why the fuck would I really want to take that fight? There's nothing in it for me.
fighting against smaller opponents his entire career. From Amir Khan to Josito Lopez, Miguel Cotto, Alfonso Gomez, Matthew.
Right, but come on, man. Like, when Canelo Alvarez was fighting a lot of those smaller guys, at least a lot of them, a lot of those were in the early part of his career when he was still building up as a fighter. Dante's Boxing Nation tries to phrase Canelo Alvarez like he's just been fighting these tiny guys for his whole entire career. Canelo Alvarez fought guys like Alfonso Gomez and Kermit Cintrone and guys like that Matthew Hatton when he was still on his way to a title run to attaining his first title. Canelo Alvarez, after he started winning actual titles at 154, I mean, he still fought a couple of smaller guys like Josesito Lopez, but a big part of the reason for that fight was because they were trying to build up the Canelo versus Victor Ortiz fight, which would have been a great fight, but Victor Ortiz fucked that fight up by getting his jaw broken against Josesito Lopez. And then, of course, later he fought Amir Khan, but they were trying to build the Gennady Golovkin fight. But I understand people's perspective to where if you can fight, this guy who is smaller, why not fight Crawford? Right, but Canelo Alvarez, it's different when you're in there with a guy that is an all-time great level talent versus a guy that that is beatable, or a guy that is clearly not on the same level. Now, is that me stating that Canelo Alvarez thinks that he's going to lose to Crawford? No, but he realizes that there's more of a threat in there. And that's going to happen with anybody. You don't, even if a guy is moving up a couple weight classes, you don't just overall go in that fight, and say, oh, well, I completely believe in myself, even though this guy's moving up a couple weight classes. No, at the end of the day, you still have to take that guy very potentially seriously, because that guy is still an all-time great level talent. And at the end of the day, it's not been the only time someone has actually went up a couple weight classes and beat somebody, like Roberto Duran beat Sugar Ray Leonard. So Canelo Alvarez, I think that he's a little bit wary because, he realizes that there's really not much in it for him. But then on top of that, he realizes that if I'm not careful and that if I take this for granted, Crawford in some rounds or in certain spots, he can possibly beat me in certain areas. So I mean, once again, Canelo's gonna have to be very careful with this. But I mean, I would favor Canelo Alvarez quite heavily within this fight because combined with the skill and the size, I just think that it would be too much. And Canelo Alvarez facing Terence Crawford, I think that he probably would be the most skilled fighter that Terence Crawford has ever fought. And to be honest with you, I really don't even think that it's that debatable. And certain people may say, well, do you believe that Canelo is more skilled than Spence? Absolutely not even a debate. Not even a question in my mind. Other than maybe faster feet and maybe feet, there's not really one area that Errol Spence beats Canelo in. He doesn't really beat him in, hand speed, at least at his best. He doesn't beat him in defense. He definitely doesn't beat him in head movement or upper body movement. He doesn't beat him in boxing IQ. He doesn't beat him in anything, really, other than, once again, maybe maybe power for his weight class, but even that's a debate because Canelo has great, excellent power, but I'll give Spence power. And then on top of that, probably maybe a little bit of better feet, but other than that, not much.
Hatton, Floyd Mayweather, and the list goes on and on and on. And he has never asked for $150 million to fight any of them because Canelo Alvarez, he knows how skilled Terence Crawford is. And he does not have the confidence that he can beat this welterweight. In fact, I almost feel that if Canelo was forced to either fight Benavidez or Crawford, he would choose to fight Benavidez first. Because there's no doubt about it, Benavidez is bigger, but he has more flaws. And when
Well, I'd agree with that, but it doesn't really matter. Benavidez, and people also must understand this. When you're fighting a guy that overall is not only going to be larger, but someone that's also about 6'1" to 6'2", like a David Benavidez, and someone that's going to rehydrate like over 200 pounds, that's going to be such a problem to get over. And that's why I say, people just treat weight or they treat height and reach like it's the same exact thing. Like, they compared Crawford to when he fought Madrimov to when Canelo fought Bivol. Dude, it's not even on the same planet. Bivol is 6 foot. He's a dude that's 6 foot and a natural light heavyweight. Canelo is 5'7" and a dude with a 71-inch arm reach. Crawford is a guy that's 5'8" with a 74-inch arm reach. He can even go up all the way to 160 and so someone carry himself because of the way that he's built. Canelo Alvarez, the things that he's had to do, especially with the amount of weight separated by some of those weight classes, you have to literally be an all-time great level fighter in order to accomplish some of the things that he has accomplished. Like when you take a look at Madrimov versus Terence Crawford, Crawford's not really smaller than someone like an Israel Madrimov. In fact, he even was heavier, I believe, in that fight. And he looked just fine to me. Now, he did look slower. Now, to be fair, when certain people move up in weight, they end up gaining a little bit more weight and ballooning up in weight in order to have a little bit more power and have a little bit more size. So, I mean, I'm sure Crawford maybe hydrates more around the 160 to 165 range. But still, Crawford is a guy that could easily fit at 154, no problem. He's not this super small dude. So people keep trying to frame it like it was when Mayweather was competing at 154. It's really not the same thing. Because not only is Crawford even taller and lengthier than Floyd Mayweather, but he's a guy overall that's a decent amount heavier. Like, he outweighs Mayweather by probably a good 15 pounds.
Comes to Terence Crawford, Canelo Alvarez, he really only has a puncher's chance. Now, as I was making this video, there were new reports coming in. William Scoe, he came out and he confirmed that Canelo Alvarez's team has already reached out to him for a fight in May. Now, I know none of you guys know who William Scoe is, but I'm going to go ahead and do a separate video.
And I'm hoping that fight don't happen either, because no one's asking for a William Scoe fight. But once again, Canelo, I think, is looking for a massive payday pretty much at the end of his career. He's looking really to only take one or two more big fights, and he pretty much is going to call it a day. I don't think Canelo Alvarez is going to do this much longer. I think that he wants to do it longer, but I think Canelo realizes that his body is starting to break down. He doesn't have much time left.
On that story. With that being said, I'm going to wrap this one up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for that part of the video. But anyways, let's see what John Boxing has to say. Let's get into his side of the conversation. Okay, so now we're going to review this video, where I'm going to review two videos by Mr. John Boxing, pound for pound the best. And he's not really anywhere near as big of a channel as Dante's Boxing Nation, but I still like to review some of these guys that might have smaller channels, because they still have opinions, and in my view, should be talked about at least a little bit or addressed. And Dante, once again, a lot of these guys, they get this shit from Dante and Aki TV, and they believe a lot of the same shit. That's why they have so many subscribers, because once again, they have a lot of delusional people and a lot of super bitter and pro-racial people that also take advantage. And don't get it twisted. There are other channels as well of different demographics that also do the same thing, that hate on Mayweather or black fighters or other fighters as well. So they're definitely not the only ones. But that's pretty much what a lot of this is based in. Pretty much a lot of resentments and bitterness. But anyways, let's get into it. Let's see what John Boxing has to say, because this video is titled that Canelo Alvarez is an average boxer at best. So let's see what he has to say.
The truth about Canelo Alvarez is that he's an average fighter at best. I don't think Canelo Alvarez is a dominant fighter. I think...
Well, that doesn't really make any sense, because first of all, if Canelo Alvarez is an average fighter at best, once again, the man is 5'7", 5'7.5", with the 71-inch arm reach. And the man is a four-weight division champion, beating the likes of guys like Gennady Golovkin, Danny Jacobs, Arislani Lara, Miguel Cotto, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, Jermell Charlo, Jaime Munguia, when he was looked at pretty much at the best point in his career, Austin Trout, Sergey the Crusher Kovalev, and you're telling me that this dude apparently is this average fighter. And he's 5'7", pretty much grossly undersized, especially for light heavyweight and even a little bit for super middleweight. And he's been able to accomplish all the things that he's been able to accomplish and beaten all the 8 grade level names that he's been able to beat. That doesn't make any sense. But anyways, continue.
He's an average fighter at best, and he's shown that he's average. I think Canelo Alvarez has gotten away with selecting the right opponent that will make him look dominant. But see,
Well, what I'll state is this. Canelo Alvarez, at certain times overall, you can tell that he has not really wanted to fight the style of the quote-unquote quick-footed, in-and-out, slick fighter, because you can tell that Canelo, that he has a little bit of a problem with that style. That's what I'll state. But Canelo has fought a lot of A-grade level names. Listen, at the end of the day, when the Austin Trout fight called for it, he fought him. When it called for the Golovkin fight, he fought him. When it called for the Lara fight, he fought him. When it called for the Saunders fight, he fought him. And the Caleb Plant fight and the Smith fight. When it called for Jaime Munguia, now, I mean, Jaime Munguia wasn't really the fight that everybody wanted to see. But at that time, Jaime Munguia had destroyed John Ryder. He was coming off of a victory over Sergey Derevyanchenko. 2 solid B-grade level fighters, probably. He beat some other names too. Jermell Charlo, who allegedly was better and more skilled than Canelo. That's what these guys were alleging. But anyway, to be fair, I don't know if John Boxing was alleging that, but that's what Dante and Aki TV were trying to put that bullshit out there. And all this other stuff. So, once again, Canelo Alvarez, he's an average fighter at best, but yet he can beat all these guys. Something's not adding up.
People's overlooking the truth about Canelo Alvarez.
The truth about Canelo Alvarez is that he's an all-time grade level fighter. Does he have flaws? Yes, he does. And of course, you see the picture of cement feet. What I will state is this. That probably is Canelo Alvarez's main and major flaw, is that he has never really had the best of feet, and especially slow feet, and at times been a little bit flat-footed. But pretty much in every other category, he's great. All-time great in. He has great power, you know, not the quickest hands that I've ever seen at his peak, but I mean, you know, fast, still relatively fast. Excellent head movement, excellent body movement, you know, excellent defensive ability when he was at his absolute peak, a very hard fighter to hit, excellent boxing IQ, just a very excellent all-around boxer. And that's why he was able to win his fights over Gennady Golovkin, or at least the second and the third one. He was able to just get a decision over Lara, even though that was a fight that, in my view, could have won either way. But they gave it to Canelo because he was the more marketable fighter. And on top of that, it was a fight that could have won either way, you know? But anyway.
And accepting Canelo Alvarez for what he truly is, and that is an average fighter at best. That's what Canelo Alvarez really is.
Well, no offense against you, sir, but you really have no idea what you're talking about. An average fighter, even if we want to compare on that plane, and I wouldn't call anyone that's accomplished what Canelo Alvarez has done as a quote-unquote average fighter. An average fighter, if you want to claim like an average level champion, I would say someone like a David Lemieux. Or if we want to talk about it, like a Ricky Burns or someone like that. Those, in my view, would be quote-unquote average champions, or champions that will be champions for a moment in time, but they're not going to be champions for a very long time because they just don't have that it factor. Canelo Alvarez has beat a certain amount of fighters that would be looked to have a quote-unquote it factor, or at least be A- to A+ level champions. He's beaten A+ level champions when they were looked at it at the time, like Gennady Golovkin. He's beaten A- level champions like that of a Caleb Plant or a Saunders or a Jamel Charlo or some other guys like that. But anyway.
Is an average fighter. Let me explain. Every time Canelo Alvarez stepped up in competition, he either struggled or he's lost. Dimitri Bivol. When Canelo Alvarez fought Dimitri Bivol, Canelo Alvarez proved to everybody that night that he does not know how to make the proper adjustments.
Well, first of all, here's the thing. Canelo Alvarez was grossly outsized in that fight. Now, Canelo Alvarez did balloon up a little bit extra in weight in terms to try and beat Dimitri Bivol in the powerhouse, but it was never going to work. Canelo doesn't belong in that weight class in the first place. There's no way that you should be 5'7", someone that has the same height and reach as some welterweight and 140-pound fighters. Now, of course, once again, Canelo was girthier, but there's no way that you should be fighting someone that is really a natural middleweight. So there's no way that that dude should really be fighting at the light heavyweight division. No way in hell.
Dimitri Bivol was able to dominate Canelo.
That's why, once again, when these guys try to compare Crawford versus Janibek, is literally not even a comparison. It's not even comparable. Because, once again, Canelo Alvarez, once again, he's 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach. Crawford is a dude that, can he can go around and fight in other weight classes because he's a guy that, in terms of his natural physical dimensions and his weight, he can go up a little bit higher in weight.
Alvarez, because Canelo Alvarez did not make any adjustments.
Well, he really couldn't in that fight because Dimitri Bivol was way too powerful for him. He was way too big, and on top of that, Canelo just completely ran out of stamina in the first part of that fight. There was really nothing that Canelo could do. Now, is that me just completely letting Canelo Alvarez off the hook? No, not absolutely. Of course, we've seen the type of style that gives Canelo Alvarez the most amount of problems a little bit in that fight, but on top of that, it's just very obvious that Canelo doesn't really belong in the ring with someone like Dimitri Bivol in the first place. He's just way, way, way too big. Now, if Dimitri Bivol was maybe more of a natural size, like a 168-pounder, then okay. But he's been at light heavyweight his whole entire career. Dimitri Bivol is the only person that's never been knocked down or stopped against an Artabitabev. And he actually was able to make that fight very competitive and close. So once again, that shows you not only how great of a fighter Dimitri Bivol is, but on top of that, once again, his size. Canelo never should have been against that dude in the first place.
Dimitri Bivol caught on to what Canelo Alvarez was doing, and Dimitri Bivol downloaded information, and then he was able to dominate Canelo Alvarez because Canelo Alvarez did not give him a different look. Canelo Alvarez only had a plan A. He did not have a plan B, nor plan C, nor plan D. And that's why Dimitri Bivol was able to dominate Canelo Alvarez, because Canelo Alvarez...
Well, part of the reason why Bivol was able to beat Canelo is because his style is very good, in my view, for beating Canelo because of his slow feet. But on top of that, Canelo Alvarez wants to win. Again, he just never should have been in the ring with Dimitri Bivol in the first place. So these guys keep trying to do this bullshit narrative about, oh, Canelo, he lost to Bivol because, you know, he's really not that great of a fighter, blah, 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 all their bullshit. Dude, come on. Like, Canelo is a guy that started off at 154 in his career. And he's a guy that really, once again, when you talk about his fights with Gennady Golovkin and other guys like that, he was smaller than those guys. Like, if you take a look at Canelo when he fought Golovkin, he was actually smaller than Golovkin. When he fought Caleb Plant and when he fought Callum Smith, when he fought, you know, those guys, he was smaller than them. He was smaller than Danny Jacobs. He was smaller than Sergey the Crusher Kovalev. Canelo Alvarez was smaller than those guys. So that's why a lot of these people, once again, they keep claiming this shit. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. I don't think Crawford has ever actually been in the ring against an A-grade level fighter to where he's actually been legitimately outsized, like out-lengthened and overall, you know, to where you can tell a clear size differential between those fighters.
Showed Dimitri Bivol.
I mean, Victor Postol, I guess, was a little bit lengthier. But, I mean, come on. Victor Postol, I mean, I give him an A- over Victor Postol, but Victor Postol is not this world beater.
He does not know how to make the proper adjustments. Dimitri Bivol had an easy night the night that he fought Canelo Alvarez.
Yes, as he should have.
Canelo Alvarez fought Miguel Cotto. Close competitive fight.
No, not really that close and competitive. He pretty much won that fight about 8 rounds to 4. Now, Canelo clearly outsized Miguel Cotto by about 1 or 2 weight classes. Cotto never really should have been at the 160-pound weight class in the first place. To be honest with you, even though Cotto was good enough and great enough to win belts at 154, in my view, he never really was even a natural 154-pounder. Now, he's a big girthy for a welterweight, but in terms of his height and reach, Cotto is 5'7" with a 67-inch arm reach. He never really should have been above the welterweight class. But Canelo was able to completely outbox Cotto when he still probably was around a natural 154-pounder, and was starting to grow into the 160-pound weight class. But no, Canelo clearly won that fight.
He fought Daniel Jacobs. Close competitive fight.
Close competitive fight, but one that Canelo Alvarez completely won.
He fought Eris Laura. Close competitive fight. Many people thought he lost that fight.
A fight that could have went either way. But the thing is that just because all or a lot of your bigger fights are close and competitive doesn't necessarily mean that you're a quote-unquote average boxer. That just doesn't make any sense. If we take a look at Sugar Ray Leonard, for example, he lost his first fight with Roberto Duran, a guy that he never should have lost to in the first place because Roberto Duran was coming up 2 weight classes. There was no way in hell that he really should have lost to Roberto Duran. Then he fights Tommy Hearns, is probably losing the fight against Tommy Hearns until he knocks him out because Tommy Hearns never really had the best of chins nor the best of defense. Then he fights Tommy Hearns in a rematch. Really probably should have lost that fight. Then he eventually ends up fighting Hagler, and a lot of people thought that he could have lost that fight. It was somewhat of a close competitive fight, at least 8 rounds to 4. So does that mean that Sugar Ray Leonard is a quote-unquote average boxer? That just doesn't make any goddamn sense. You know, once again, these standards have never been done before, but these guys are all of a sudden trying to pull these standards out of their ass, you know, all of a sudden, because once again, they realize that Canelo Alvarez is a threat, and they want to do this with boxers that they're trying to degrade or that they want you to not be remembered as the best of their generation. Like, come on.
All saw what Floyd Mayweather Jr. did to him. Austin Trout, close competitive.
Because if we really want to be petty, if we really want to be petty, you know, we can state overall about how Terence Crawford in the early part of his career, you know, had a very tough outing with the Yuriorkis Gamboa that really should have never been at 135 in the first place. On top of that, had a year layoff. And on top of that, was clearly way undersized against Terence Crawford. And Crawford was losing the first half of that fight against Gamboa. We can mention that. If we really want to be petty, we can mention about how Israel Madrimov gave Terence Crawford probably about a 7 rounds to 5 fight, and he never fought an A-grade fighter in his life, at least in professional boxing. And then on top of that, you know, he only had about 12 professional fights. And Terence Crawford moves up to 154, has a 7 rounds to 5 fight with him. You know, we can mention that. You know, we can mention about how Terence Crawford was probably losing the first part of the Sean Porter fight, which at that time was probably the most talented fighter and the greatest fighter that he'd ever fought in Sean Showtime Porter. We can mention that, you know, if we really want to be petty. But like I said, you know, I'm not putting these bullshit standards on Terence Crawford because I think a lot of those things are quote-unquote excuses. But it's just so interesting how they put these standards on Canelo, but they won't on Crawford. But once again, the person that has the higher standards on them is usually the greater one.
The fight. Triple G 1 and 2. Close competitive fight.
Right, so you're telling me that Canelo Alvarez, pretty much who did not really fight any elite 160 pounders before Miguel Cotto and Triple G. You're telling me that Golovkin, who was looked at as top 5 pound for pound on everybody's list, sometimes even top 3, you're telling me that Canelo Alvarez had 2 competitive fights with Gennady Golovkin, a guy that was looked at as top 5 level pound for pound and a guy that was looked at as the favorite heading into that fight. Wow, that's just completely unheard of. Like, this dude is such a fucking moron.
So, in other words, each and every time Canelo Alvarez fights someone who's elite or world class, he's always in a close competitive fight.
Right, and he's mainly won them. So once again, Canelo Alvarez has to be remembered as all-time great because we don't have these standards for Sugar Ray Leonard. We don't have these standards for other certain fighters that have been in very competitive fights. If Canelo Alvarez is an average fighter, then what does that make Bernard Hopkins? Because he ended up beating guys like Kelly Pavlik and Winky Wright and those guys. But then against Joe Calzaghe, against the prime Roy Jones Jr., against Chad Dawson and Jermaine Taylor, he lost all those fights. So what does that say about Bernard Hopkins then? Does that mean that Bernard Hopkins is not an all-time great fighter? But these guys won't say that.
Why? Because Canelo Alvarez does not know how to insert his dominance because he's not a dominant fighter whenever he's fighting someone who is just as dominant as he is. Canelo Alvarez has fooled many of you guys. He's fooled many of you guys because of how dominant he looks when he's fighting someone who is not at that level. And I'm talking about world class. Whenever he's fighting someone who's not world class, he looks dominant. But when he's fighting someone who is world class or considered world class, he never dominates. And so,
Well, when someone can make the point is this. In Terence Bud Crawford's biggest fight of his career, he completely dominated Errol Spence. Now, looking at it with that fight, because I did not realize that Crawford was going to have the level of effect with his power over Errol Spence Jr. I knew that he always had A-grade level power. I did not think it was going to be on that level. But Errol Spence is pretty much the perfect type of fighter, overall calibrated for that of a Terence Bud Crawford. Someone who's not really super fast, someone who really doesn't move his head off the center line. Errol Spence does not have great head movement. Now, of course, that being stated, it was still looked at as a top 5 pound per pound fight, so I give Crawford a lot of credit. He, in a way, and, Usyk to a degree, they were the most dominant probably in their pound for pound level fights. That's something that maybe you can say about Canelo Alvarez. But to say that Canelo Alvarez is just this average fighter because on all of his fights, he's had competitive fights. Okay, so then are we going to talk about Terence Bud Crawford against Sean Showtime Porter? About, how competitive a fight he had with Sean Showtime Porter, a guy that had been beaten already about 3 separate occasions, and Terence Bud Crawford was losing the first half of that fight? Are we going to talk about how Crawford just had a 7-5 fight over an Israel Madrimov that was out lengthened by several inches? Are we going to talk about that?
I always say, if Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez were the same size, Terence Crawford will completely destroy Canelo Alvarez. Terence Crawford is an all-around better fighter than Canelo Alvarez.
Well, you can debate that. But once again, that's pretty much the point of his video, which is that, I want Terence Bud Crawford to be remembered as greater than Canelo and better than Canelo. So I have to allege that Canelo Alvarez is this quote-unquote average fighter. And he probably believes that in his mind, but he's a moron. It just is what it is. There's no way that you can be an average fighter, beat all the champions and all the A-grade level guys that Canelo has beaten and just be a quote-unquote average boxer. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But anyway.
Terence Crawford has better feet. He has better ring IQ.
Well, he has better feet, but to be quite honest with you, Terence Bud Crawford, if we really want to talk about it, Terence Bud Crawford is probably the most overrated defensive fighter of his time. A lot of people take a look at Terence Bud Crawford because he's this black, slick American fighter, and they think that he's this Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, and they think that he's this Floyd Mayweather Jr., and he's not. And in similar fashion, people take a look at Canelo Alvarez, and they think that he's this Marco Antonio Barrera or Eric Morales and loves to get in wars. Neither of those fighters are like that. Canelo Alvarez, fights similar, to some of the black American fighters. Now, does he have as fast a feet or as slick as feet as what a Crawford does, or a Pernell, or a Floyd Mayweather Jr.? No, of course not. But in terms of upper body movement and in terms of a certain amount of his counters and attacks and other things that he does, yes, Canelo Alvarez is an all-time great level boxer, and you can tell that he takes some things from those boxers. Terence Bud Crawford, he is a very good defensive fighter when he's at his best. Like I said, I've seen Crawford pull out one great defensive performance, and that was against Errol Spence Jr. when he needed it. But to be fair, Errol Spence is not the fastest of fighters in terms of his hand speed. But take a look at Crawford's fights against Sean Porter. Take a look at his fight against Israel Madrimov. Take a look at his fight against Jose Benavidez. Take a look at his fight against Felix Diaz. Take a look at his fight against Yuriorkis Gamboa, where he got, very badly hurt, I believe, in the final round. Take a look at his fight against some of the other fighters. Crawford is not a defensive master. He just never has been.
He's a switch hitter.
Now, Canelo has definitely gotten more hit in more recent years, but a big part of the reason why that is because he's been clearly aging as a fighter for the past 3 years. Canelo, overall, once again, he's been fighting now professionally for 20 years. Even when Crawford was more at the peak of his career, and even when he was more in his prime, because Canelo was not really in his prime anymore, and I wouldn't say that Crawford really is now either. He's probably been aging now for the past couple of years. But even when Crawford was looked at as more peak, he still got hit in his career. Like, he still got hit against Sean Porter. He still got hit against Jose Benavidez. He still got hit against Felix Diaz. He still got hit and badly hurt against Yuriorkis Gamboa. He still got hit and hurt overall against guys like Aegis Kavalaskas. Terence Crawford is not a defensive master. Now, is he better in the foot category? Yes, he is. But in terms of defense, is he greater than Canelo or better than Canelo in terms of the defensive category, at least peak v peak? No, absolutely not. And I know that a certain amount of people overall that they're not going to like it, but it is what it is.
Faster hands. He has better punch selection. He's a better thinker. He's an all-around better fighter than Canelo Alvarez. The only thing that Canelo Alvarez has going for himself is his power. Canelo Alvarez is physically stronger than Terence Crawford because he is significantly bigger than Terence Crawford.
Right, well, that point would make sense if Canelo Alvarez was also fighting at the welterweight division, or if he was fighting repeated welterweight fighters and he was bringing them up overall a couple of weight classes. But that doesn't really make any sense because, once again, Canelo Alvarez, it would be different if he was 6 foot and beating some of these guys, but he's not.
Even with his size, a lot of people still believe that Terence Crawford can jump up 2 weight classes and make a fight with him and Canelo Alvarez very competitive because of Terence Crawford's abilities.
But anyways, and to address that final point, for those of you that also remember when Canelo wanted to move up to the cruiserweight division and fight Ilunga Makabu, the African fighter, they said, well, Canelo, if you're really that good, don't fight Ilunga Makabu, fight Alexander Usyk. They would never say that with Terence Bud Crawford. That's why certain guys are saying, Crawford shouldn't fight Canelo, or they're making up the excuse. But Canelo gets no excuse when he loses to Bivol, or if he were to lose at the cruiserweight class. 2 weight classes that he has no business being in. But anyways, let's take a look at the last video, then I'm pretty much going to end it right there. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at this last part of the video. And once again, we're going to see what John Boxing has to say, because this is titled Terence Crawford is greater than Canelo Alvarez explained. And listen, if you want to debate that Crawford is greater than Canelo, I think that's fine. But once again, these guys just go way too far with it. It's obvious that these guys are morons, but I mean, it is what it is. But that's the reason why I like to review their videos, to kind of unleash, some boxing history, because I grew up watching both of these guys. But anyways, let's get into it.
Will not tell about Canelo versus Terence Crawford. Showbiz talked about this fight, and I don't think he told you guys the full truth. I think he told many of you guys what you wanted to hear, because...
Well, the truth can be different for many different people. And I think from John Boxing's perspective that he probably is telling the truth, but he's not really ever going to be able to tell the truth in full coherence because his motivations are completely emotional and completely racially motivated. And that's why when these guys like Dante, Aki, TV, John Boxing, when they claim overall that we're here to tell the truth and the whole truth, no, what they really say is that I'm here to spread my political, pro-racially motivated bitterness. That's pretty much what they're here to spread. Because they do not have the ability, overall, once again, to really be logical. It just is what it is.
Majority of those people over there are Canelo Alvarez fans. And so Showbiz is not going to tell the full truth about Canelo versus Terence Crawford. I am, and I'm expecting a lot of Canelo Alvarez fans to come over here butthurt, because the truth tends to do that to Canelo Alvarez's fans. It pisses them off when someone tells the truth about Canelo Alvarez. Now,
well, the truth, quote unquote, really pisses off a lot of people because the truth is really something that a lot of people really don't want to hear. But what the truth is to me is something that you can quote unquote qualify, at least with evidence. Saying something overall that Canelo Alvarez is a quote unquote average boxer, I don't really know how that makes any sense, because Canelo Alvarez is a 4-weight division champion that has beaten a lot of A-grade level names in his career, beaten some pound for pound level talents, and beaten some of the more skilled and some of the more dangerous boxers out there. Now, if he was a guy like Junto Nakatani or something like that, and then he finally fought a big guy and then ended up losing, then I would kind of understand it. Or if it was a Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez situation, then I would kind of understand a little bit more, but that's not Canelo Alvarez's story. So, once again, it's very clear that a lot of the shit that these guys are pushing is just propaganda.
I told you guys before, Terence Crawford is a better fighter than Canelo Alvarez. But I think Canelo Alvarez beats Terence Crawford at 168 pounds. Now, just because...
Right, and that's something that, in my personal view, that's not, completely off-kilter. That's not something that is completely delusional. That's fair to say, I think, if you want to state that. Now, my personal view, is Crawford way more skilled than Canelo? No. To be quite honest with you, in my view, in terms of skill, they're probably on the same level. Now, there are certain things that Canelo does better. There are certain things that Crawford does better. I definitely think that Crawford has better feet, but in terms of defense, I think that Canelo definitely has better defense, at least when they're both at their absolute best.
I think that Canelo Alvarez beat Terence Crawford at 168 pounds doesn't mean that I believe that Canelo Alvarez is better. I believe he beats Terence Crawford.
Well, I'll go one step further. I'm not even quite sure if Terence Bud Crawford, if he would beat Canelo Alvarez when Canelo Alvarez was back at 154 pounds. I'm not even sure if Terence Bud Crawford could have beat that version of Canelo. Now, I would have gave him a better chance because Canelo was less experienced, and on top of that, overall, he was still learning some of his craft and his boxing ability. But even the Canelo that fought Austin Trout, even the Canelo that fought Lara and some of those guys, when he clearly was still trying to adjust to his game, I'm not even sure if Crawford would have beat that version of Canelo.
Because he's
who was way smaller than what he is now.
Significantly bigger. Now, I know size don't always matter in a boxing match, but in this particular...
And also what I'm going to have to claim is this. For Dante's Boxing Nation and some of these other guys that claim that Canelo was quote-unquote so overrated and all sort of stuff, and, they're favoring Crawford to such a great degree. Okay, well, what I'm going to tell you is this. In that fight, Canelo's probably going to outweigh Crawford by about 15, maybe 20 pounds. If Canelo is this average boxer, let me tell you what. If Usyk can beat Tyson Fury, who is not an average level boxer, and someone that they were putting on a high level before they knew that he actually was going to beat Deontay Wilder, then what that means is that if Crawford does not beat Canelo, that he can't be over Usyk. Simple as that.
Case,
but you're not going to hear them say that.
It does. Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez are not heavyweights. They're not. These guys are separated by a significant amount of weight.
Right, as were Usyk and Tyson Fury, so don't try to compare it, man. Don't try to sit here and say overall that they're both heavyweights and just try to sit there and claim that bullshit about how Usyk and Tyson Fury, they're both heavyweights. Dude, Usyk is fucking 6'3" with a 7-8" arm reach, weighs 220, 230 pounds. Fury is literally like 50 to 30 plus pounds bigger than him at the very least, and is 6'9" to 6'8" with his 85 arm reach. Come on, man.
Terence Crawford is not used to fighting past 154 pounds. Canelo Alvarez is. So Crawford and Canelo are separated by a significant amount of weight, and that will play a huge factor.
I agree it will. But if Canelo Alvarez, once again, is an average boxer, then Terence Bud Crawford should have a great chance against him. Or at the very least, it should be 60-40.
In a fight between the two. And this is why I believe Canelo beats Terence Crawford. He beats Terence Crawford not because he's better than Terence Crawford. He beats Terence Crawford because he's significantly bigger than Terence Crawford. Okay?
But once again, Canelo was an average fighter, so why doesn't Terence Bud Crawford have a great chance?
Now, a lot of you guys, a lot of you Canelo Alvarez fans actually believe that Terence Crawford is greater than Canelo Alvarez because you're calling for this fight. You are asking Terence Crawford to do what you would not ask Canelo Alvarez to do. John Boxing, what do you mean by that? Well, a lot of you guys are having a conversation about this potential matchup, Crawford versus Canelo. We all know that Crawford will be jumping up a significant amount of weight to fight Canelo. Canelo Alvarez is not going to meet Crawford in the middle. He's going to...
And what I'm going to state is this. I agree a little bit with John Boxing there, and that's exactly why I say Dante and some of these other guys like Aki TV and Boxing Ego, they truly believe that Canelo is the best of his generation because they don't hold any other fighter to the same standard. They don't hold any of those guys at the same standard. You know, once again, Canelo, if you go up to cruiserweight, don't fight Olunga Makabu, even though it's your first fight there. Fight Alexander Usyk, literally one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters on the planet. You know, someone that's going to outweigh you by 50 pounds and someone that's going to be, you know, several inches taller than you and lengthier than you. That's who they wanted Canelo to fight if he was going to fight at the cruiserweight division. Like, are you serious? And I'm supposed to believe that Canelo, according to these guys, is just this average level boxer. Right.
Hey, Crawford come to him. And a lot of you guys are okay with that because you believe Crawford is good enough to fight Canelo at Canelo Alvarez's weight class. If you didn't think this way about Terence Crawford, then you would quickly dismiss it. You wouldn't be eager to see it so much. You would dismiss it like you're dismissing Teofimo Lopez calling out Terence Crawford. You guys know what would happen if Teofimo Lopez were to jump up from 140 to 154 pounds and fight Terence Crawford. You know what would happen. You know that Teofimo Lopez don't stand a chance because you believe that Terence Crawford is that much better than Teofimo Lopez, so you would dismiss that fight because you know what would happen if they were to fight. But you're not dismissing Crawford fighting Canelo Alvarez at 168 pounds because you believe Crawford is that much better. In Canelo Alvarez's case, if I were to ask for Canelo to jump up to the heavyweight division and challenge Alexander Usyk, you guys would call me crazy. You guys would call me a hater.
Right, and you know what's very interesting is that DontaesBoxingNation and a certain amount of these guys were actually asking Canelo to do that. That's what they were saying. They were saying that Canelo, that he's not going to fight anyone at the light heavyweight division because that division is way too talented. Then he goes up, literally fights one of the 2 best guys there in Dimitri Bivol. And he says, oh, well, you know, he's doing that because the European style is easier than Jamal Charlo. Like, get the fuck out of here, man.
Guys will say Canelo Alvarez is too small. Right? That's what you will say. He's too small and he's too short. Alexander Usyk is too big and he's too tall. Well, Canelo Alvarez did.
And also a certain amount of the reason why these people are doing this as well is because they realize that if this fight does happen and if Canelo Alvarez whoops Terence Bud Crawford's ass, which more than likely he would because of the skill combined with the size, you know, when it comes down to it, a lot of these guys are now doing damage control, so they can now say, oh, well, Terence Crawford only lost really because of the size. Well, once again, I would say that that's a valid excuse, or that that's a part of the excuse, as long as, once again, you know, you claim that Canelo is a great boxer, but you can't claim that Canelo is this average boxer. You can't claim that he's this dude that's super overrated and nowhere near as skilled as Terence Bud Crawford, and Crawford is actually taller and lengthier than Canelo Alvarez, and he's this guy that's this average boxer. Like, these guys act like this dude is like Isaac Pitbull Cruiser or something. Okay, so if he's an average level boxer, no problem. Why can't Terence Bud Crawford beat him? Because it's not like Canelo Alvarez is some Sebastian Fondora or Dimitri Bivol who's super tall or lengthier than Terence Bud Crawford. It's not like that's the situation, so then why can't he beat Canelo Alvarez if Canelo's an average boxer?
Have any problems fighting someone who was the same height as Alexander Usyk? Colin Smith is 6'3". Alexander Usyk is 6'3". So the height is not really a problem for Canelo Alvarez.
No, that's not true at all. The height definitely is a problem. The thing is just that height is less important on a guy like Callum Smith than what it is a Bivol, because Bivol has more boxing ability than what a Callum Smith does. And I still think that Callum Smith was an A- level win for Canelo. You know, a lot of people try to treat Callum Smith like he was some pushover. Listen, don't get it twisted. Does he have a little bit of stiff tendencies for the regular Caucasian British fighter? Yes, he does. But people also forget that he pretty much ran through some of that weight class, including George Groves, overall, once again, who gave Carl Froch 2 very tough fights. You know, people forget that. And then he beat Chris Eubank Jr. to become the champion, you know. And I believe that Callum Smith ended up knocking him out within about 6 rounds. So it's not like Callum Smith just was this complete bum of a fighter. Now, does he have his flaws? Yes. Is he a little bit too stiff like the regular Caucasian British fighter? Yes. But that doesn't mean that he was not an A- level win. Even take a look at his fight against Archer Betterbeef. He gave more of a challenge than Joe Smith Jr., gave him pretty much just as tough of a fight as an Anthony Yard, and some other fighters in that weight class. So Callum Smith is just not this bum that many people are trying to pretend that he is. And he's definitely better than any of the British fighters that Terence Bud Crawford has fought. I mean, give me a break. Now, I would say that Kell Brook would be better than Callum Smith, but by the time he fought Kell Brook was so done.
The problem with you guys will be what? The weight difference. Just like there's a weight difference between Crawford and Canelo. You don't mind Terence Crawford being at a huge weight disadvantage, but you mind if Canelo Alvarez was at a huge weight disadvantage. You see,
right, well, same shit goes with DontaesBoxingNation and a lot of these other guys. I understand what this man is saying, and I agree with him. But DontaesBoxingNation and a certain amount of these other Terence Bud Crawford fans are doing the exact same shit. And a certain amount of these guys are calling for this fight because they realize that it is a win-win situation for Crawford. He can't lose.
You guys don't believe in Canelo Alvarez that much, but you believe in Crawford. You believe in this man so much that you're eager to see this fight happen between Crawford and Canelo, but you don't want Canelo Alvarez to go up to the heavyweight division and challenge Alexander Usyk. And don't say that that's never been done before, because Roy Jones done it. He sure did. Roy Jones.
Isn't that very particularly interesting that Canelo Alvarez would have to go all the way up to the heavyweight division, but Terence Bud Crawford, who's now a champion at 154, he would be going up all the way to 168. Canelo Alvarez. I mean, don't get it twisted. I guess I kind of understand it because, Terence Bud Crawford, he's never even been a champion at 160 before, so he'd be jumping up 2 weight classes, but Canelo, he'd be, he's not a champion at cruiserweight either, so I guess it's somewhat similar. But there's such a massive size difference when you talk about that jump up versus Crawford jumping up, but I understand what he's saying.
Started his career off at the junior middleweight division and worked his way up to the heavyweight division.
Right, but Roy Jones Jr. at his absolute, full size, he's a lot bigger than Canelo. So come on.
See, Roy Jones didn't even fight at the cruiserweight division. He went from light heavyweight to heavyweight. If Canelo Alvarez is really that good, then he would try to cement his legacy by trying to duplicate what Roy Jones did. That is
right, but Canelo Alvarez is allegedly this average boxer, so why are you comparing him to guys like Roy Jones Jr.? Once again, people will tell you how great they actually think someone is, even just with the comparisons. Even if they're possibly not on that level, they'll say, oh, well, Canelo's not an all-time great level fighter. Is he on the level of a Floyd Mayweather or Roy Jones? Right, but those guys are literally all-time great level fighters. So the fact that you're even comparing to Canelo Alvarez in the first place has to mean that he's an all-time great, because what that means is that Canelo Alvarez, you're not comparing him to guys like Sugar Shane Mosley or Miguel Cotto or Oscar De La Hoya. You're comparing him to literally the best of the best. You're comparing him to literally the top 10 fighters of all time.
Considered legendary, which is moving up to the heavyweight division and capturing a world title. You see, you guys would think of that as being unrealistic, but you will want Terence Crawford, the much smaller fighter, to jump up 2 weight classes to be at a size disadvantage to fight.
Well, what I'll say is this. If Sugar Ray Leonard can beat Marvin Hagler, and if Floyd Mayweather Jr. can beat Canelo Alvarez, why not Terence Bud Crawford against Canelo if Canelo Alvarez is this average boxer? That's what I'll ask.
Canelo Alvarez. But you don't want Canelo Alvarez to challenge himself to prove that he's great by putting himself at a size disadvantage by jumping up and challenging.
Right, but Canelo has already proven that in his career. No offense against Terence Bud Crawford, but he's never really been at a massive size disadvantage in any particular fight in his career. It's never happened. And I know that a lot of people are not going to like that, but it is what it is. Errol Spence was not that much bigger than Crawford. He may have been a little bit girthier, but he's not really that much bigger. Definitely not lengthier than Terence Bud Crawford. And when you talk about Madrimov, that dude wasn't bigger than Crawford at all. Give me a break.
And the Usyk. Because if Canelo Alvarez is great, so you guys say, then he will try and duplicate what Roy Jones did that is considered legendary.
Right, so Canelo Alvarez, who's way smaller than Roy Jones Jr., shorter by about 4 inches, and a guy that has a shorter reach by 3 inches overall. We expect Canelo Alvarez to do what Roy Jones Jr. did. Isn't this funny? This is the same guy that said that Crawford is now a 4-weight division champion just like Canelo, and Canelo lost one of his 4-weight division, overall fights, and Crawford won it. Isn't it interesting? All of a sudden now this guy knows that a win in certain divisions aren't always the same. Isn't that interesting?
Without you guys even saying it, you are basically telling people by calling for Crawford to fight Canelo that you think that Terence Crawford is greater than Canelo Alvarez.
Yes, and without you saying it, you truly believe overall that Canelo Alvarez is not just an average boxer. This dude really doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. But anyway.
It's because you are eager to see this fight, but you're not eager to want Canelo Alvarez to go up to the heavyweight division and challenge Alexander Usyk.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it. I just thought that I would review those videos because I thought it was very particularly interesting. But as you can see, these guys really don't know what the fuck they're talking about, and they truly don't believe in some of the shit that they're actually saying. But I understand what some of the points John Boxing was bringing up, but also a lot of the same standards have been brought up with Canelo. And people forget that certain people actually were saying that if Canelo was going to move up to cruiserweight, that he should fight Alexander Usyk and not Ilunga Makabu, even though it would have been his first fight there, which is absolutely ludicrous. But anyway, but once again, these guys, they don't truly believe in a lot of the bullshit that they say. And as you can see, they're just dumb. Like, these guys are dumb as a pile of rocks. The average person, to be quite honest, he was really dumb as a pile of rocks. Most people really don't know shit about what is going on or what they truly want to analyze. They really overall, once again, are not that particularly swift, especially guys that are overly emotional and guys that are very bittered. They're never going to have a clear sense of logic or objectivity or a sense of the actual truth, because the truth to them is always going to be majorly distorted. Whenever you deal with someone that's highly emotional and highly a fan of somebody or someone that has an agenda, they're never really going to be able to tell somewhat of a truthful or objective perspective, meaning that they keep the same standards, across the board. They're never going to be able to do that, once again, because they have an agenda, But anyway, emotional people usually have an agenda or something that they need to get out there. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see where this goes. But I keep hearing about the potentiality of there being a Canelo versus Crawford fight. And what I'll say is this. I'm not really the biggest fan of the fight. But if you're one of these people that are calling for the fight and you're saying that Canelo is this average boxer, well, then Terence Crawford should be able to beat him then. If Canelo is just this overrated and super, a super one-dimensional fighter, and this guy, once again, that doesn't have a plan B, plan C, okay, well, Crawford should have a great chance against him then. It should be 50-50 at the very least, So we'll see. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.